In the autumn of 1923, in a mill town pressed between the Fraser River and the rock face of the Cascade foothills, a woman named Vera Caldwell was accused of something she had not done. The accusation was simple and devastating, the way all truly damaging things are: whispered first, repeated louder, and eventually accepted as settled truth before she had a chance to speak. The man who might have spoken for her stayed quiet, and the town, which had never quite known what to make of Vera anyway, found it easier to believe the worst. What the town did not know was that a man named Thomas Holt had watched it all from the edge of things, the way he watched most of what happened in Harwick. Quietly, without announcing himself, he was 41 years old, a widower who had come to Harwick 6 years earlier with nothing but a good name, and the kind of silence that made people uncertain whether he was peaceful or merely waiting. He ran the grain depot at the south end of town, kept his accounts clean, spoke when spoken to, and otherwise kept himself to himself. His wife, Catherine, had died of fever in the second year after their arrival. He had not courted again. No one asked him why, and he did not explain. Thomas had seen Vera Caldwell for the first time 3 springs ago, when she had come to the depot looking to arrange storage for her father's supply shipment. She had been calm and practical, and not the least bit interested in impressing him. He had appreciated that without dwelling on it, watching what the town was doing to her. The accusation had begun with a ledger. Vera worked as a bookkeeper for Harwick Mercantile, a position she had held for 7 years. She was 32 years old and unmarried, a fact the town found less troubling than it might have, because she was plainly useful, and usefulness in a woman of a certain age was its own kind of permission to exist without apology. She kept the accounts accurately. She arrived before the owner and left after him. She never shorted a customer, never padded an invoice, and never once dipped her fingers into the petty cash tin that sat unlocked in the back room. In September, the Mercantile's owner, a man named Gerald Finch, discovered that $400 had gone missing from the business account over the course of the summer. Gerald Finch was the kind of man who found certainty comfortable, regardless of whether it was earned. He looked at his books. He looked at the person who kept his books, and he arrived at his conclusion the way a man arrives at a destination he had already decided to visit. He did not confront Vera privately. He told his wife over supper. His wife told her sister. Her sister attended the Tuesday sewing circle. By Thursday, the story had acquired details then seemed to know. Vera heard it first from a child. One of her neighbor's daughters, 9 years old and earnest, came to her door to return a borrowed cake tin, and said with the guileless accuracy of children everywhere, "My mama says you stole from Mr. Finch." Vera thanked the child for the tin and closed the door and stood very still in her kitchen for a long time. Then she put on her coat and walked to the Mercantile. Gerald Finch received her in the back room, which smelled of cedar and turpentine and old paper. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his work table with his arms crossed, and his expression already settled into the shape of a man who had made up his mind. "I'd like to see the accounts," Vera said. "I've already reviewed them. Then, I'd like to review them as well." Gerald's jaw tightened. "I don't think that's appropriate, given the circumstances." Vera looked at him steadily. She had worked for this man for 7 years. She had corrected his arithmetic on 17 separate occasions. She had once stayed until midnight reconciling a shipment error that was entirely his fault and said nothing about it to anyone. "The circumstances," she said evenly, "are that someone took money from this business and you've decided it was me. The books are your responsibility." "Yes, and I'd like to look at them." He did not let her. She left without raising her voice. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, the autumn air hit her face, and she breathed it in slowly, deliberately, until her hands stopped wanting to shake. Thomas heard the story on Friday morning from the postmaster, who told it with the careful neutrality of a man who was enjoying himself too much to take sides openly. Thomas listened. He thanked the postmaster for the mail. He walked back to the depot and set the letters on his desk and sat for a moment looking at nothing in particular. He had known Vera Caldwell long enough to know three things with certainty. She was meticulous. She was honest to a degree that occasionally inconvenienced people around her, and she was not a thief. He also knew one other thing, which was that knowing the truth and being able to prove it were not the same thing, and that in a town like Harwick, the first person to say a thing loudly enough often won by sheer momentum. He did not go to see her that day. He went to see Martin Oakes instead. Martin Oakes was the bank manager, a quiet man of 55, who had processed every significant financial transaction in Harwick for the past 2 decades. He was also, as far as Thomas knew, the only person in town with access to the records that would show where Finch's money had actually gone. Thomas was not a man who called in favors often. He had accumulated a small number of them over 6 years of fair dealing and reliable character, and he spent one now, asking Martin Oakes for an hour of his time and a careful look at the Finch Mercantile account statements. Martin Oakes was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Give me until Monday." The weekend was difficult for Vera. She went to the market on Saturday morning because she needed flour and eggs, and because she refused to arrange her life around other people's comfort. She kept her back straight and her expression composed, and she did not hurry. 3 women she had known for years found reasons to look elsewhere as she passed. A 4th offered a tight, uncertain smile, the kind that wanted credit for kindness without actually committing to it. At the flour counter, a man she did not know well, a new arrival who ran the lumber supply, nodded to her without hesitation and said good morning as if nothing were unusual. Vera accepted the greeting with genuine gratitude, though she did not show how much it cost her. That evening, alone in her house, she opened the notebook she kept for her own accounts. Personal expenses, household costs, every cent she earned and spent, and read through it from the beginning of summer to the present. The numbers were what they always were, precise, modest, and completely irreconcilable with someone who had access to $400 she should not have had. She closed the notebook. She thought about Gerald Finch standing behind his table with his arms crossed. She thought about 7 years. Then she made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window and watched the river move, dark and indifferent, through the failing light. Thomas came to her door on Sunday afternoon. He stood on the step with his hat in his hand, which was not a gesture he made often, and Vera noticed it. She let him in without ceremony and offered coffee, which he accepted, and they sat at her kitchen table like 2 people who had both learned, separately and at some cost, not to waste time on performance. "I haven't found proof yet," he said before she could ask. "But I don't believe it. I want you to know that." Vera looked at him for a moment. Why? It was a fair question, and he treated it as one. 7 years without a single discrepancy, he said. That's not luck. That's character. Vera set her cup down. Character doesn't seem to count for much this week. No, Thomas agreed. It doesn't always. But it's what I've got to work with. She studied him, the careful set of his face, the stillness in him that she had always read as reserve, and now found herself reconsidering. He wasn't being kind out of some abstracted sense of duty. He was being accurate. There was a difference, and she had lived long enough to know it. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. "Look at the bank records," he said. "Finch's accounts go through Martin Oakes. There may be something there, worth finding. He won't show you. He's already agreed." Vera was quiet for a moment. "Why would you do this?" Thomas turned his cup once on the table. "Because the truth matters," he said, "and because silence on wrong things is its own kind of wrongdoing." He left shortly after. Vera stood at the window and watched him go, his long coat moving in the river wind, and she felt something loosen very slightly inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but the absence of complete aloneness. Monday arrived gray and cold, with frost on the window glass and the smell of wood smoke threading through the town. Thomas arrived at the bank before it opened. Martin Oakes met him in the back office, a room lined with filing cabinets and the particular silence of accumulated numbers. What Martin had found was not dramatic. Fraud rarely was. The money had been moved in small amounts across 3 months, attributed in the account records to supply invoices that did not match anything in Vera's ledger. The invoices had been signed, but not by Vera. They bore Gerald Finch's own hand, disguised only slightly and not quite well enough. Martin Oakes sat with his fingers laced together and explained what he was looking at without editorializing. He was the kind of man who believed facts deserved to stand without decoration. "He moved the money himself," Thomas said. "That's what it appears, and let her take the fall for it." Martin said nothing. The silence was answer enough. Thomas asked for copies of the relevant statements. Martin Oakes prepared them with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that some things, once seen, carried obligations. That afternoon, Thomas went to Vera. He knocked twice and she opened the door and read his face before he said a word. Whatever she saw there made her step back and let him in. He set the documents on her kitchen table and explained what Martin Oakes had found. He did not soften it. He did not make it smaller than it was. He told her plainly. The money had been moved by Gerald Finch, the records showed it clearly, and the invoices that were supposed to justify the withdrawals were fabricated. Vera sat with the papers in her hands and read through them without speaking. Her expression was controlled, the way a person looks when they are feeling something too large to be allowed out all at once. When she set the papers down, her hands were steady. "He needed the money," she said quietly. It was not a defense of him. It was just Vera, who made sense of things even when the sense was ugly. "It doesn't matter why," Thomas said. "No." She folded her hands on the table. "What happens now? We take this to the constable, and we take it to Finch first if you want him to have the chance to correct the public record before it becomes official." Vera was quiet for a long moment. "Give him the chance," she said. "Not for him. For the fact that I'd rather be seen as someone who dealt fairly than someone who struck hard." Thomas nodded. He had expected nothing less and was not surprised, and the absence of surprise felt like its own kind of recognition. They went together to the Mercantile the following morning. Gerald Finch was behind his counter when they arrived, and he understood within seconds why they were there. The color left his face in a slow, visible way, like water draining from a pan. Thomas set the copies of the bank statements on the counter without preamble. Finch looked at them. He looked at Vera. He looked at Thomas. "You have until the end of today," Thomas said, "to go to the constable yourself and set the record straight. If you don't, I'll bring these documents on your behalf." Finch said nothing. Vera looked at him steadily. She did not look angry. She looked like someone who had already made peace with the shape of a difficult thing and was simply waiting for it to finish. "7 years," she said quietly. "I worked for you for 7 years." Gerald Finch looked at the documents on his counter. Something moved across his face that might have been shame, if shame had not had such a long way to travel to reach him. He went to the constable's office before noon. The news moved through Harwick, the way corrections always moved, slower and quieter than the original story, and without anywhere near its confidence. People received it differently. Some were chagrined. Some reconfigured their memories to suggest they had never quite believed it. A few said nothing at all, which was a kind of honesty. The women of the Tuesday Sewing Circle, a special meeting, did not hold a special meeting. The postmaster mentioned to no one in particular that he had never been entirely convinced. Gerald Finch's wife moved posture of someone with the careful, something heavy and invisible, Move the kid. Vera returned to work at the Mercantile for exactly 3 days, long enough to ensure a clean handover of the accounts to the young man Finch hurriedly hired as her replacement. She did not slam doors. She did not make speeches. She updated the ledger with the same precision she had brought to it for 7 years, and then she thanked the junior clerk for his patience and left. Thomas heard all of this secondhand from various people who seemed to think he would want to know. He did want to know. He did not say so to anyone. 2 weeks after the resolution, on a Thursday evening in late October, Vera came to the grain depot as it was closing. Thomas was stacking receipts when she appeared in the doorway. He set the papers down and, "I've been offered a position," she said. "In New Westminster, an accounting firm. They want someone to manage their client records." "That's good work," he said. "Yet, yes." She did not move from the doorway. "I wanted to tell you before I told anyone else." He was quiet for a moment. The evening light was coming through the high windows at a low slant, laying gold across the plank floor. Outside, the river moved. "When?" he asked. "January, if I accept." "Will you accept?" Vera looked at him with the direct attention that he had always found both clarifying and, in ways he had not entirely examined, difficult to withstand. "I haven't decided," she said. "I've been thinking about what there is to stay for." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that had weight to it, that meant something. Thomas said, "Then perhaps you'd consider having supper with me while you think." The edge of Vera's mouth moved. "That's a careful way to put it. I'm a careful man." "I know," she said. "I've noticed." She did not say yes right away. She stood in the doorway of the grain depot in the late October evening and looked at him with those clear, measuring eyes, and he looked back without flinching, and the moment held them both in it, without demanding anything more than honesty. "Thursday next," she said at last. 7 o'clock. Thomas nodded. "I'll make sure the account books are put away." The edge of her mouth moved again, further this time. She turned and walked out into the evening, her figure moving through the long amber light at the end of the street, unhurried, upright, taking the road at her own pace. Thomas stood in the doorway of the depot for a moment after she had gone. The river was audible in the distance. The air smelled of coming rain and fallen leaves and the particular cleanness that arrives in a town after something complicated has been resolved. He went back inside and finished stacking his receipts. He found he was not thinking about the work. They had supper. Then they had it again, the following week and the week after that. They walked along the river road on Saturdays when the weather allowed and stayed at the table, talking long after small things and large ones, about the river and the mill bells, about the river and the way the mountains looked different in every season, about her father, who had died 3 years ago, and his wife, Catherine, who had died 2 years before that, about grief and the geography of it, the way it didn't disappear but changed shape, and how a person learned, eventually, to live in the landscape it left behind. Vera talked the way she worked, precisely, without waste, but not without warmth. Thomas listened the way he did most things, carefully, and with his full attention, which she found she valued more than she had expected to. By December, she had not written to the firm in New Westminster. By January, she wrote to decline the position. She did not tell Thomas immediately. She told him in the way she told him most important things, quietly and directly, without ceremony, over coffee on a Sunday morning at her kitchen table. "I've decided to stay," she said. Thomas looked up from his cup. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad." It was not a grand declaration. It was Thomas, and she would not have wanted it any other way. They were married in March, in the small Anglican church at the edge of Harwick, with a modest gathering of the people who had stood by Vera during the autumn, and a few who had not, who came anyway with the subdued manner of people who understood they owed her something, even if they couldn't quite say it aloud. Thomas had no family left to speak of. Vera had her mother and 2 cousins from the valley who arrived the day before and stayed for the weekend and filled the house with a kind of noise that Thomas found, to his own surprise, not unwelcome. At the reception, held in the church hall, with tea and good cake and not too much fuss, the junior clerk from the Mercantile came over and shook Thomas's hand and said, a little awkwardly, that Miss Caldwell, Mrs. Holt, he corrected himself, had been the best bookkeeper Harwick had ever had, and anyone with eyes should have known she'd never have done what Finch said. Thomas agreed that they should have. The clerk nodded and retreated to the cake table. Vera appeared at Thomas's side a moment later. She had heard the exchange. "You were diplomatic," she said. "I try," he said. She looked out at the room, at her mother talking to the cousins, at the constable who had handled the Finch matter, and who had treated her throughout with scrupulous fairness, at the women from the sewing circle, who had come and who were managing each in their own way the transaction of attending an event they had not expected to be invited to. "I used to think," Vera said quietly, "that being useful was enough, that it counted as a kind of belonging." Thomas listened. "It doesn't," she said. "Not on its own." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at him then. Being chosen is different. He held her gaze with the steadiness she had come to know as particular to him, as reliable as river current and considerably warmer. "Yes," he said, "it is." Outside, the March wind moved through the Fraser Valley, carrying the smell of thaw and pine and wet earth. Inside the church hall, the light was warm and the noise was easy, and Vera Caldwell, who had spent years being overlooked in a town that prided itself on knowing everyone's business, stood in the middle of it all and let herself, finally, be found.